Welcome back to Leadership Blueprints, everybody. I'm your host, BJ Kramer. Last week, I did a solo episode on the idea that leadership is leverage, or like the sign behind me say, leaders are levers. And I've been thinking a lot about that this week, had some conversations with different leaders in my company. And the whole point of that is that leaders' job isn't to do more, but it's to multiply your impact through other people. And if we get too focused on transactional and extraction leadership, not multiplication leadership, um, we lose ourselves as a leader. But I think, and I've talked about this before, I think that the true calling of a leader is to help other people become the best version of themselves. And when we do that, and when we connect the dots between the individual and the mission of the organization, I think that when you activate all of those individuals, the organization becomes the best version of itself. Um, Now, it sounds great when I talk about it. It sounds exactly what any leader would want to do. But the practical question is, if leadership is leverage and my job is to multiply my impact and unlock the best version of other people's selves, why do I still feel like my team isn't reaching its potential? So today's guest, he and I are going to talk a little bit about innovation, a little bit about unlocking potential. He is Brigadier General, retired John Dragon Teichert. Did I say your last name right?
BJ, you nailed it.
Awesome. I love when I get it right. Um, and obviously, as a Brigadier General and having a call sign Dragon, he's probably led in some crazy places, which we'll get into. But sir, welcome to the show. I want to get your quick reactions to this big idea of unlocking other people's potential, and how do we do it?
BJ, I think what you just said was a mic drop moment. I think all of that intro was perfect, but I want to supplement it with two quotes that came to mind as you were talking. The first one is from Herb Keller, the founder of and original CEO of Southwest Airlines, who said that you can truly tell what an organization values by looking at two things: its calendar and its checkbook. How it spends its time and how it spends its money are actually its values, not what they have on a wall as a mission statement, not what a leader says his priorities are, but how do they actually invest in priorities with time and money. And that's a true indication or reflection of the real values. And so I think part of the answer to the conundrum that you raised is that as leaders, there's a ton of demand on our time, that we're bombarded with requests from all corners of our organization and the environment that we're in. But if we're not intentional about investing our time and our money in developing people to become the best possible version of themselves, then we're fooling ourselves. That the only way you can actually implement or operationalize that priority is by spending time and money on it. So that's the quote from Herb Keller. Another quote came from a crazy strategy professor I had in an Air Force school called SAS, School of Advanced Air and Space Studies. You read a book a day, you discuss it for 2 hours a day, you write a lot of papers, you speak a lot. And he had an interesting definition of strategy because he didn't like the normal definition where we talk about the confluence of ends, ways, and means, or how do you use ways and means to produce ends, because he didn't like the word end, because there's no end in strategy. The end of a phase is simply the initial
The
condition
next
of the
phase.
next phase. But I actually like using that definition, and his definition was a plan for continuing advantage, for strategy. How do you set up a plan to have a continuing advantage as you move through different phases of a strategy? But I like that as a leadership definition to some extent. That I am not a good leader just because during my 2 years as a commander of the President's Airfield Joint Base Andrews, which I was from 2016 to 2018, I'm not a good leader because we thrived during those 2 years. Actually, the real reflection of how I am as a leader is how things went the 2 years after that and the 2 years after that. And with the people that are doing that mission when I'm sitting on my front porch talking about the good old days in my rocking chair because I invested in them. And so I think the idea that leaders sometimes get myopically focused on the here and now because of all of those demands. But if you think about leadership, that it spans a continuum that includes long after you are gone, then it helps you as a leader get in the right mindset that you've got to balance appropriately. How am I doing at the mission today versus preparing people to thrive in that mission long after I'm gone?
I I couldn't agree more. As you're talking about it, I'm big into youth sports right now. I got little kids, and I love the sport coaching analogy for leadership a lot. And as you're talking, Joe Ehrman, who is a retired Baltimore Colt, he's that old, wrote a book, Inside Out Coaching. And in it, I'm not gonna get the quote exactly right, but he was asked at the end of the season, "How'd your boys do this year?" And he said, I'll let you know in 10 years when these boys become men, because I'm not here to win games. I'm here to build men that are good contributors to society." And I think the Simon Sinek wrote the book Infinite Game, and I think that's the same mindset, that our job is to help set people up for, they may not stay in our organization forever, they may not stay in our profession forever, but it's to set them up for success as they continue to grow and move on. So I love that. As
Can
a
I give an
Yeah,
example of that?
I,
And I love the idea of I'll tell you in 10 years how
yeah,
I did. When I was a lieutenant in 1997 at the 492nd Fighter Squadron at RAF Lakenheath in the United Kingdom, flying F-15E Strike Eagles, we had a leadership chain that prioritized not just making us good Strike Eagle pilots and Wizzos so that we could succeed in combat, but in intentionally developing us into the leaders that the Air Force needed in the future. And I find it fascinating that when I was a wing commander 20 years after that, in 2017, the chief of staff of the Air Force calls all of his wing commanders in for a 2-day conference. There's not a lot of us in that room. And maybe like most people, when I go to a conference and I sit in my assigned seat, I look around to see who I know so that I can talk to them at the next sidebar coffee break. And I recognized in that room that there were 7 of us in that room in 2017 who had been lieutenants in the 492nd Fighter Squadron in the RAF Lakenheath in the UK in 1997. I started thinking about why. And I came to the conclusion that our leadership team, 4 of them, a lieutenant colonel named Junior Summonsby, a lieutenant colonel DO, director of operation named Killer Quast, and 2 flight commanders who were in their mid 20s, Ozzie Nelson and Ludes Ludwig, were intentional about developing us, investing in us to be leaders. And the manifestation of that was 2 decades later, 20 years later, that now there are 7 of us in a very small room who are leading bases and wings in the United States Air Force because someone invested in us and that investment manifested itself 20 years later.
that's amazing. What I'll just react to that. What was it that they did as lieutenant colonels? By the way, those names sounded like they were right out of like Hollywood. Ozzie Nelson and what was the other guy?
Ludes Ludwig, Killer
Ludes, yeah,
Quast, and Junior
yeah.
Summonsby.
um, what do you think it was? I'll call it tactically, that they were doing on a regular basis, to expose you to that, to train you in that, to develop you that, in your words of, or in Herb Kelleher's, to demonstrate with their calendar that they were invested not in your success in the role you were in, but also in your success over the long term of your career.
They were very intentional about creating a combat leader and leadership syllabus for us. And then they held us accountable with regular investments of their time and probably to some extent money to assign us something, have a discussion about that thing, either one-on-one or in small groups as we progress through. And I didn't even know if it was really that formal of a syllabus, but it was very clear that each meeting we would talk about what we had been essentially assigned at the previous meeting. And then there would be another set of expectations for the next meeting a week from now or 2 weeks from now. And it was a process that lasted a couple of years as I transitioned from a lieutenant into a young captain, that they were investing in us. And I think that's a great example of they were truly putting on their calendar something that demonstrated their priorities, which was us. I was a young lieutenant. What did I really matter? But they knew that all of us at some point would either be future leaders in the Air Force or otherwise, just citizens in our great country, and investing in us made sense. And if they could pour themselves into us to help us become the best possible version of ourselves, then would be good for the United States Air Force, but would be good for the United States of America. And the ultimate mission of the United States Air Force and the Army and the Navy and the Marine Corps and the Space Force and the Coast Guard and others is to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. That's the mission. And I think sometimes people get caught up of whether you should be a people first leader or a mission first leader.
Hmm.
And I understand that you're in an organization to accomplish a particular mission. But if you look at the mission as the long-term mission, support and defend the Constitution of the United States, or whatever your organization's real mission is, then the best way you accomplish that mission is pouring yourself into people who will accomplish that mission now and well into the future. And I think they had a good sense of doing that by keeping us accountable and putting times on their calendars and our calendars to make sure that they were demonstrating their commitment to that priority by investing in us.
I think that's so great. There's a book, Greater Than Yourself, Steve Farber, and the whole idea of the book is like your job is to grab somebody and it's your job is to pass on your wisdom to make them be more successful than you were. And I think if you activate that in an enterprise, only good things can happen. And I think that DoD across the board, I believe, and I know that there are instances where this may not be true, but are really focused on developing leaders in a consistent basis. I think some places, like your experience in 1997, probably do it really, really, really well. Other places, maybe not. And sometimes that's the op tempo or whatever. I don't want to debate that. I do want to think about the idea of enterprise, large scale organizational enterprise leadership, and me as a small business, 65 employees, or maybe somebody that's like, I only have three people in my small business, and we're so focused on survival. Where am I supposed to find the time or money to invest in other people? And my quick answer is find the little ways to be intentional. I love that, I'm a big believer that leaders are readers, and it sounds like you were nudged early on to pick up the reader habit. And I think that nudging earlier, and then it becomes that habit that you're taking the initiative to read more. But what are ways that smaller organizations that might not have a big checkbook or a big calendar available to them to do the leadership development, how do they do it?
Yeah, so I think at the most basic level, whether you're a wing commander of 17,000 people or you've got a few people in your sports league in your community that you're trying to lead, is that I think it goes back to two innate human needs. And I don't think these have changed over time. People need to be loved or cared for, and people want to be part of something greater than themselves. If you think about those two elements of humanity and how, in your context, in your situation, you can demonstrate genuine care and concern or love, and how you can help them understand that they're tied into something that is more important than themselves, then I think that's the secret to the thing you started this podcast with, which is how do you unlock individual talent and how do you unleash the teams that you lead? And I think it may be as simple as the first time you show up as a leader or a new person shows up in your organization, then finding time one-on-one to sit down and to talk to them. Not just because you're spelling out expectations, though you should in that first meeting, but just getting to know them. One of the most powerful things that I experienced when I entered the test pilot world is that I showed up for this evaluation thing called Five Flight, where you weren't quite accepted to test pilot school yet, but you went out there for a week and you flew. That the director of operation named Sulu Hill, a hero of mine still that we talk a lot, said, "Hey, I just saw you showed up. I saw you came from this base. I came from a base that was adjoining to that. Let's go out for lunch." And he didn't talk to me about test, though he did a little bit, but he just said, "Hey, let's go grab a cup of coffee or let's go grab a burrito at Taco Bell." Anyone can do that. He was a busy guy, the director of operations for test pilot school, but
Yeah.
he wanted to start a process of the new guy coming into the organization and number one, feeling loved, understanding through some of his words about test pilot school why it mattered, but also then role modeling what I should do when I was in his position when a new guy or new gal showed up like I showed up. And
Right.
I think that even if it's 3 people or 3,000 people, it doesn't matter. If you think about your leadership role in terms of unlocking and unleashing individual talent and your team, and you realize that those two innate human needs are so fundamental to the humanity that we're a part of, then you find ways to spend your money and time and the way you treat people, caring for people, loving people, helping them become the best possible version of yourself. By the way, that doesn't mean you're always buddy-buddy with them. There is a continuum of leadership tools that start with the fun ones of inspiration and encouragement. The middle ones are equipping, challenging, and convicting. And then the unfun one is correcting. I use
Yeah.
all of those, but I do it in a sense that I'm trying to help you become the best possible version of yourself. And it's just like me as a dad. I've got 3 kids. They're all in college or just out of college. And the way I lead them is in a lot of ways the exact way that I lead the people that are on my team. I show them love. I use a range of leadership tools to help them become the best possible version of themselves. And I help them tie into something that is more important than themselves. And when we do that intentionally at home, at church, in a sports league, in the neighborhood, or at work or at school, then now we unlock and unleash.
I think it's awesome. Any specific example of where you felt like these tools, and I would like to use the corrective ones where like, hey, I hate having to go into the corrective bucket, but, and I think most people want to avoid the hard conversations, but I also think that the hard conversations is where the most real love, tough love come out and how you deploy those corrective actions successfully, it is, I think, sometimes the biggest leadership wins. Any specific examples you can think of from your leadership toolbox where you use those corrective tools, and it could be at home. I'm okay with anything, but
Yep.
you had to implement corrective action and tough love.
So, in general, talking about a plan for continuing an advantage, one of the benefits of having been a leader at multiple levels over the course of my career is that about weekly, sometimes more than that, I'll get a phone call, a text, a LinkedIn message, or some other message that says, "Hey, sir, you probably don't remember me, but I worked for you. We went through this situation together." And often it happens to be the case that they were situations where there was some correction, where they were headed off the right track and I got them on the right track or was part of helping them get on the right track.
Yeah.
And they reach out to share, "Hey, sir, this is what you did. This is what I'm doing now. And thank you for helping me get on the right track, but giving me a second chance that was appropriate based on the situation or context." And those are the best messages that I get because you realize that this plan for continuing advantage doesn't just mean you're inspiring. I love doing that part of leadership. That's super fun. Get up and rah rah.
Yeah.
But it's the tough situations. But I think the tough situations are made easier by 3 things. Number one, if you have very early on set clear expectations. Set clear expectations. 90% of the time, leadership experts say that someone falls short or fails. It's because they weren't either given clear expectations, or point number two, they weren't giving appropriate regular feedback. And so point number two is don't just bottle up your frustration with somebody until they do something really bad or until you give them an annual performance report that is horrible. Have a process where you've set expectations and you regularly revisit those expectations. Maybe it's a hot wash. Maybe it's an after action report. Maybe it's a debrief. That's something that we use every single flight I've ever done in my whole life, training, test, or combat. We sit down in a room afterwards and we assess ourselves to our objectives and try to find root cause when we fall short. But have a regular cycle of feedback. And so now set expectations, have a process of regular feedback so you stop the problem at the earliest possible level, and then do it all in a sense of I am truly trying to help you become the best possible of yourself. You said this is what you're trying to achieve in life because we talked about it on day one over a cup of coffee. This is what you're trying to achieve. You're diverging from ever being able to do that thing. Let's find a way so that you can get back on the right track. So you're opening the right door. So maybe that continues to be a possibility. Or maybe you're in a position that isn't right for you. This isn't your right position. Let's find something that is better for your skill set because we'll be happier with you. You'll be happier with us, and you'll be doing something you think that matters. There may be a point where you need to move them on. Sometimes that
Right.
happens for the betterment of everyone else. But I think if you set expectations, nip things in the bud early, and then demonstrate this level of concern that you're really trying to help them, just like I do with my kids, then now the feedback that you give, while tough to accept, is taken in the spirit of love or genuine care and concern because you're giving it in that spirit. And now they're more likely to accept what you're saying than if they're in a defensive crouch because they're getting attacked out of the blue because you never addressed this problem previously.
I love it. How about those middle tools? I know that the rah-rah speech and the inspiring and painting vision, everybody knows how fun and I don't think easy, but exciting vision casting is. We talked about corrective action. How about the middle tools?
Well, let me start with the inspiration where sometimes it's the rah rah, like you said, it's super fun as a commander. You get up on a big stage and you give a rah rah speech. But sometimes inspiration and encouragement is as simple as, hey, I noticed that you had a baby. Congratulations. Let
Yeah.
me write a card to you and your spouse. Or, hey, I heard that your mom's been in the hospital. Um, I'm going to pray for you. I'm going to actually pray for you. And then you follow up and make sure things are going okay. And I think those individual touch points can be as inspiring as the big rah rah. Let me give you an example of that. When I
I
was a commander, a wing commander, I tried to write two handwritten notes a day throughout the tenure of my command, 1,500 in a 2 year period. And I would do that, and I would have this sensor network where I would hear what's going on and how can I recognize somebody. But the thing that struck me, BJ, is as I would get out of my office and walk around the trenches of my organization, that note that took me 2 minutes to write was often posted up on a bulletin board in someone's cubicle next to their spouse and their kids and the greatest things that bring them joy. It took me 2 minutes.
yeah.
But because I reached out on an individual level, I gave them the gift of time and attention and words of affirmation, then now it's something that's posted up on their wall of fame. And that blows me away. So there's ways that you can do the inspiration and encouragement at an easier, more basic human level. But then the equipping, challenging, and convicting, those are all some of the bread and butter that we should be doing every day. Are we making sure that our workforce is trained to be able to do what they're supposed to do today? And are they preparing for what they're going to do next year and in a decade to follow? And am I pushing them out of their comfort zone so that they're growing as the natural manifestation of not being in a position where they can rely on complacency? And am I challenging them to rise to the next level? One of the other things that people sometimes badmouth servant leadership or people first leadership is that they say that leaders have low standards who are just trying to be servant leaders. The opposite is true. If I genuinely love you or care for you, then I'm going to have the highest of standards and I'm going to believe that we can get to those standards. It's a little bit like my kids. I've got 3 kids. I've got a second lieutenant in the United States Air Force waiting for pilot training. I've got a senior in college and a junior or a freshman in college. And if you ask my middle child, Tiffany, who was a little bit of the challenge in our family, she's a great young lady. She's going to go serve a federal law enforcement agency and do a great job serving our country in that way. But if you asked her two things, does your dad love you? She'd say absolutely yes. If you asked her, does your dad have too high of standards for you or too low of standards for you? She would say too high. It's because I love her that I have high standards. And so that blocking and tackling of equipping, challenging, and convicting is pushing people out of their comfort zone, raising the bar, providing them the tools to meet that bar and any bar in the future. And I think if you're doing that range of things over the course of your leadership continuum based on the situation, the person, then now you're going to connect in a way that resonates with them.
Awesome. Super valuable. Equipping, challenging, and convicting. That's gonna. sit with me for a little while. Uh, I want to move to some rapid fire questions. We opened up with a couple of quotes, but any favorite quotes in your leadership repertoire?
This is one that I use in mentoring the most, and it's a Dragon original. So don't
Okay.
discount it just because it's a Dragon original. And I'll tell you where it came from. It's to be tactically content, but strategically restless. Tactically content, but strategically restless. And this is what I mean that a lot of times people are looking out into the future and they're trying to figure out, hey, I want to get to here. But they miss opportunities to make an impact today. And when they miss the opportunities to make an impact today, the doors for the future don't open up. So they don't make an impact today and they can't make a greater impact in the future. That's the tactically content. The strategically restless is have enough in the back of your mind about where you're headed. So you're starting to take some of the basic steps to get there. But the big warning is don't sacrifice the here and now by focusing too much on the future because the future will never come to be if you're not focusing on the here and now. This actually originated from an astronaut friend of mine named Mash Dutton. When I was going through a phase in my life where I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do when I grew up, I don't really know, but that's okay. But he directed me to Psalm 119, 105. Thy word shall be a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. And the idea is that there is a spotlight shining on your feet right now, which is here is where you are. Here is what your role is. Here is what you are supposed to do. Kill it at what you're doing now. And then there's this vague light out in the future of where you're supposed to be headed. There's not a lot of fidelity there. Don't think that there's a straight line between here and now and your goals. There's a lot of zigzagging, tacking. Obliquity is a word that sometimes people use where you're doing these oblique turns and twists
Yeah.
eventually to get there. But focus on the spotlight on your feet today to make an impact. And in general, follow this fuzzy light into the future. And it was that verse that stemmed that quote that I love to mentor people with, which is being tactically content and strategically restless.
Psalm 105.
Psalm 118, 105. Thy word shall be a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path.
That's great. How about favorite books in your library for let's go with just giving maybe the opening to somebody starting to develop themselves as a leader because I'm sure you've got a lot in your library.
I do. I love leadership books. I've written my own, but I'm not going to give you that one. The There's two. My two favorite secular leadership books. I'm going to circle back to a third in a bit. The one that I've read 3 or 4 times, including when I was a young leader, is Lincoln on Leadership. Lincoln on Leadership. And every chapter is a characteristic of Abraham Lincoln, how he manifested or exemplified that characteristic, and what the results were and why it matters. And I love the idea that you can go through chapter by chapter, and it's not a book about leadership. I don't like those. It's a book about a leader, and it helps narrow down what are the characteristics that make a good leader. I read it as a young guy. I've read it fairly recently. The second book is a lot like it. It's called American Generalship. It's a 30-year study of 4-star generals during and since World War II. And just like Lincoln on Leadership, every chapter is a characteristic. And it goes through how have some of our 4-star leaders exemplified that characteristic? How did they implement it? And what was the result? And why does it matter? And I typically for Christmas give my subordinate leaders books. And those 2 books are the most common books that I have given out. The American Generalship is a little more heady than the Lincoln on Leadership, but I recommend people check out both. And like I said, I have put my money where my mouth is on that one by giving out a lot of copies of them to subordinate
Yeah.
leaders. And then I say the best secular leadership books. There's no doubt that the book I read every single day, which is the Holy Bible, is the most important book on the planet for leaders, for followers, and otherwise. And I would be remiss and lack integrity if I didn't bring that up as the best leadership book. In fact, part of my devotions this year is reading through John Maxwell's Leadership Bible,
I
which
have it on
is,
my I have it
yeah,
on my nightstand.
yep. I just retired my chief engineer from F-22 test, and that was the gift he gave me. And it's a part of my daily devotions now. So I'm being more intentional about reading through the Bible and looking for those important leadership nuggets that are there all along. And I've noticed a lot of them, but I like doing it as a disciplined study.
I saw you mentioned that you wrote a book, and I do want to ask you about it. But I also saw you wrote a devotional. So talk to us about the writing process and what was it that you I think that one, you have to have a gift to write, and then two, you have to have something that sparks you and feels like, hey, I want to share this with the world to go through the pain of writing a book.
So
So talk
all
to us
of that
about
is
that.
true. Yeah, that is true. I started the process about 2.5 years ago. Shortly after I retired, I was getting into the keynote speaking business, talking a lot about leadership and innovation. And someone that I was getting mentored by recommended, hey, you probably already have a book mostly written in your mind based on the outlines of speeches that you have given. Put it into prose and write it down. And it becomes the best calling card or business card you could have. I've given away a ton of copies, and I love the idea that this is a personal way to understand what I believe about this topic. And I think that, especially if it's written such that it's something your kids and your colleagues and your friends would be proud of, the way you have written it, because they're a part of that story, then I think it's worth the time. It took me 7 weeks part-time to write my, not counting Sundays, to write my first book. But again, those outlines were already in me, and it was a topic that was bursting to get out. I don't think I'm a particularly gifted writer, but the passion drove me through the process.
That's awesome.
Yeah,
And
and so
then how
that's
about your
book number one. Yes,
devotional?
so that's book number one. Boom is the title: Leadership That Breaks Barriers, Challenges Convention, and Ignites Innovation. Book number two is a 90-day Christian devotional on how to pray for our leaders in our nation. Prayers for a Nation is the title of that book. Book number three is a kid's book about resilience and grit. And then about a month from now, book number four is coming out, and it's co-authored with my pastor. And it's a book about American history for our 250th birthday, but with a spiritual twist. And it's going to be entitled In God I Trust, with the subtitle being Making Our National Motto My Personal Declaration. And it's going to talk about our trust in the Lord in our founding and throughout the 250 years of our nation. And then how can we apply that level of trust in our individual lives today?
Pretty impressive. All right. Maybe the last question. If you could have dinner with three people, dead or alive, who would they be?
Number one, Jesus Christ, my Lord, my King, and my Savior. That's a no-brainer. The other two, especially because I'm mindful of our semi-quincentennial this year,
Yeah.
our 250th birthday. I've been practicing saying that word because it's my new favorite word. Um, I want to give you two American figures, and because I'm looking at over your right shoulder, George Washington kneeling next to his horse at Valley Forge, I would tell you that specifically it's George Washington, but even more specific than that, I would want to go back to December 1777 and have coffee with him then as they entered camp on December 17th, 1777. I recommend all of your listeners read a general order that he published on the 17th of December, 1777, the day that they entered the camp. It's only 2 paragraphs long, but it is chock full of leadership lessons that we can apply today that basically was the foundation for how those 12,000 men that entered that camp survived that long, cold, hard winter, but then professionalized the force during that time, such that the first battle, for the first time in the 3 years of the Revolutionary War, as they emerged from camp in spring of 1778, it was the British who retreated from the Americans in the first large force battle that was won by Americans and George Washington. So George Washington is number two. Read those 2 paragraphs in general order from 1777, December 17th. And then I'm a Marylander. If people are watching on YouTube, you see an American flag behind me and a Maryland flag. And one of my heroes in American history is Frederick Douglass, an escaped slave from Maryland that found his way to New York. His writings and his speeches, he was a contemporary of Abraham Lincoln, but I love his perspective about the American experiment as a guy that could have been bitter about this country, but who loved this country and invested his free life in helping our country live up to our ideals by his writings and his speeches. And in fact, one of the things that I love talking about specifically, he was asked to give a July 4th speech up in Rochester, New York. And he basically started the speech as hey, I'm probably not the guy to give this speech because I have seen the bad end of where we are as a country. But then he went on to say this. He said, our founding documents, our Constitution in specific, are a glorious liberty document or set of documents. And he called the founders brave men and great men and gifts to humanity. And his perspective was this, that we don't have a principle problem. We had, and to some extent have, an application of those principle problems. Any shortcomings we have as a country are not because those principles are wrong. They are incredible. This guy with the sting of whips on his back from being a slave in Maryland understood that those principles were incredible and the men who wrote them were incredible. It's just that we have not lived up to what the Constitution says being a more perfect union. We're on a journey. It's an application problem, not a principle problem. And I would love to have coffee or a lunch with Frederick Douglass.
That's amazing. I I lived in Baltimore for some time, and I did not. I know the name Frederick Douglass, but not familiar enough. So you just inspired me to go back to the library to learn more about Frederick Douglass. Uh, Anything we didn't cover that you think is important to the audience, and if not, I would ask you to. You've shared so much wisdom with us, so many lessons learned, stuff that we can apply immediately. Close us out with any kind of closing inspiration.
No, thank you for having me. I appreciate it, BJ. We got linked up by a common connection on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
Really, I want to tell your listeners that we're all lifelong learners of leadership. No one has arrived. And if you're not doing things intentional to develop yourself as a leader, that's reading, that's journaling, that's paying attention to what's going on around you, then you're not developing as quickly as you should. And I'm pointing fingers at myself as I point fingers at you because I need to make sure I'm intentional and diligent about the journey that I'm on as a leader as well. I would also encourage your listeners, if there's ever anything that I can do for them, reach out. JohnTeichert.com is my website, and there's a way to get a hold of me there. But really, please just be encouraged by the fact that podcasts like this are part of the toolkit that you need and that I need to develop into the type of leaders that our people deserve. And maybe one last thought. When you become a general officer or an admiral in the military, you spend 5 or 6 weeks at a program called Capstone, where you travel around the world with your cohort of new general officers and admirals, and you talk to 4 stars and find out what's going on. And I remember going down to Miami, U.S. Southern Command, the guy at the time, Admiral Faller, who was responsible for all of U.S. military activity basically in the Caribbean and South in the Western Hemisphere. That's a huge responsibility. And one of my classmates asked him a generic question that I think in general is lame, is, sir, what keeps you up at night? But he didn't say narco-terrorism. He didn't say malign foreign influence in the region. He didn't say traditional terrorism or violence or crime. He said, the only thing that keeps me up at night is whether I am living up to the responsibility that I have to be the leader that my people deserve. That is so powerful. We need to look in the mirror often and reflect on whether we are being or developing into the type of leaders that our people now or future people deserve. And that's a powerful challenge towards the idea that we're all lifelong learners and we've got to be deliberate and intentional about getting where we're supposed to be.
Tactically content, strategically restless. And I think this is so good because we started out leadership is leverage, leaders are levers, and that it's about unlocking the potential or becoming the best version of helping other people become the best version of themselves. And I think leadership does start with us. And are we becoming the best version of ourselves? Because the best thing we can do is lead by example. And as you're talking about all of this, I'm trying to figure out when it comes to leading myself, I don't think I need to be inspired. I might need some corrective action, and I definitely need a little bit more equipping, challenging, and convicting. So, sir, I can't thank you enough for sharing your wisdom. You kind of took me all over the place on that continuum of reflection and things I've heard before, some new things I haven't heard before. But I just really enjoyed this conversation and can't thank you enough for joining us.
BJ, we meandered around a lot, and it wasn't just me, it was you too. And it's a little bit of an example of obliquity where we're getting from point A to point B, but we're not going in a straight line.
Amen. I thank you, and we will put. I'm going to add into the show notes not just your books, but also the two paragraphs from General Washington's order there. So he gave us a couple of reading assignments, and I'm looking forward to digging in.
Awesome. BJ, thanks for having me.
Thank you, sir. Hey, everybody, do us a favor. If you're enjoying the show, if you think this content resonates with you or would resonate with somebody in your network, please do us a favor. If you're seeing it on YouTube or you're seeing it on or getting it on your podcast, Spotify, or seeing it on LinkedIn, please do us a favor. Like it, share it, send it out to somebody, text message a link. I find that the most things I listen to come from a personal recommendation. So please take the time, like John talked about, send that 30-second text and share this off to somebody. Hopefully, we're adding value to your life and we can add value to theirs. Till next time, have a great week and a great weekend.